Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Library of Virginia's Women's History Month program. A woman's place is in the House, of Delegates. I'm Sandy Treadway, the librarian of Virginia, and we're thrilled to have you all here this evening for what I know will be a fascinating and important program. Now, as I'm sure you know, 2020 was the year in which we all marked the 100th anniversary of women gaining the right to vote in our country. And with women's suffrage came all the other rights of full citizens, including the right to hold public office. It took a few years, however, for women in Virginia to successfully run for a seat in the Virginia General Assembly. But in November 1923, Sarah Lee Fain of Norfolk and Helen Timmons Henderson of Buchanan County succeeded and made history in January 1924 when they took their seats on the House floor. By 1928, there were 4 women serving in the Virginia General Assembly, and you'd think that harbingered an upward trend, but unfortunately that was not the case. By 1930, that number dropped to 1, and it would be 36 more years before 4 women served at the same time in the House of Delegates. Between 1933 and 1954, there were no women at all in the Virginia General Assembly. Then Catherine Stone of Arlington broke that dry spell in 1954. She was joined 2 years later by another member, and a few other intrepid women in the 1960s, but just a few. From the late 1960s through the early 1980s, there were never more than 9 women serving simultaneously in the House. In 1983, that number rose to 13, and it remained in the teens for more than 25 years. Then between 2017 and 2018, the number of women in the House grew from 17 to 28 overnight, and it has continued to rise steadily. During the session that just ended, there were 38 women serving in the House of Delegates, and when you add the 10 women serving in the Senate, that rose the number to 48, which brought the percentage up to 34% of members of the General Assembly were women. Now, on the eve of the 100th anniversary of women's service in the General Assembly, it seems very appropriate that we pause to reflect on women's contributions across the past 100 years, on why it has taken so long for women to have a significant presence in the state capitol, and on what having the largest number of women ever to serve in our legislative body means today. And I can think of no better group of outstanding women to help us explore that and share their experiences tonight than our distinguished panelists. I'll start at the far end and work this way. Delegate Vivian Watts has been a member of the General Assembly continuously since 1996, but she served previously from 1982 to 1985. She represents the 39th House District, which includes parts of Fairfax County. When she was elected in 1982, she was only the 22nd woman ever to serve in the Virginia General Assembly. Now, she left the House for a while and served as Virginia's Secretary of Transportation and Public Safety, and then returned to the General Assembly in 1996. She is currently the longest-serving female member of the House. Her committee assignments include the Courts of Justice, Finance, Rules, and Transportation Committees. Next, we have Delegate Carrie Coyner, a member since 2020. She represents the 62nd House District, covering the city of Hopewell and parts of Chesterfield and Prince George's County. A practicing attorney, she served on numerous community boards, among them the Chesterfield County School Board and the board of the Chesterfield County Chamber of Commerce. In the House, she serves on 3 very important committees: Education, Appropriations, and General Laws, and she chaired the subcommittee on Early Childhood Education and Innovation. In 2020, she also served on the task force that commemorated the centennial anniversary of women's rights to vote. Next, we have Delegate Charniele L, a member since 2009, and she represents the 46th House District, covering parts of the city of Alexandria. An attorney, Herring was also the first woman and the first African American to serve as Majority Leader of the House of Delegates and as Chair of the House Courts of Justice Committee. She also serves on the House Rules and Transportations Committees and is Chair of the House Democratic Caucus. Finally, we are delighted to have with us this evening Professor Jennifer Lawless, who is going to serve as the moderator of our panel. She is Professor of Politics and Public Policy at the University of Virginia, and prior to joining UVA's faculty, she taught at American University, where she also directed the Women and Politics Institute. She's the author or co-author of 6 books, and her research focuses on political ambition, campaigns and elections, and the media and politics. So without further ado, I will turn the program over to Professor Lawless and sit back and enjoy what I know will be a lively conversation.
Thank you. This is on? This is on. Thank you very much. I'm thrilled to moderate the panel. Because I'm a professor, my general thinking here is that I'm going to give a little bit of background information for a series of questions. I'm going to pose the question to all the panelists, and we'll leave plenty of time at the end for questions from you. So over the course of the last 25 years, I've been doing a lot of research on why women don't run for office. And I've surveyed thousands and thousands of lawyers, business leaders, educators, and political activists. These are the 4 professions that are most likely to lead to a political career. And I've asked people, have you ever considered running for office? Do you think you're qualified to run for office? Has anybody ever suggested that you run for office? And one of the striking findings, and it's kind of sad because the results look a lot the same today as they did in 2001, is that women are about 1/3 less likely than men to say that the idea of running for office ever even occurred to them. It just never showed up on their radar screen, despite the fact that they're just as politically active and just as politically interested. So I think the first question that I would ask each of you is to just tell us a little bit about when you first became somebody that looked in the mirror and thought, oh, maybe I should give this a shot and throw my hat into the ring. Do you want to go down this way first, and then the next question will come back?
Sure. And thank you for having me here, and along with my distinguished colleagues. And I'm glad to see everyone tonight. And it's an excellent question now. So I will start with, we're told that women have to be asked. I never was raised to think that I need to be asked, because if I waited for it to be asked, it would never happen. That's just my lot in life. It won't happen. So, but what happened and occurred to me that maybe I should run is before I was elected, I was on a commission for women, and I was working on a victims' rights bill, dealing with communications with counselors. I came to Justice Mims, now retired. Actually, when he was senator, he sponsored the bill for me. I came to the courts committee. The courts committee. I believe Janet Howell was on the committee at that time, but she wasn't present. So all I saw were men up there. And I was like, well, this can't be right. I saw no one who was a minority sitting up on that committee as well. And I was like, you know what? Maybe I should run. I just wanted to have a different view of things because some of the things that were said. And just my background, being homeless as a teenager, it just sort of seemed a little bit more monolithic, and I don't know everyone's background, but I was like, there is not enough diversity sitting on this committee. That was the first time where I was like, maybe I should run. But I will tell you, I was raised by a mother who, my first vision or sort of entree into politics was actually, she took me to Capitol Hill to lobby for health care for children, and I was a child at the time. And so I would say it's my mom that gave me that sort of entree to policy and how it can help people and affect people's lives. But that time coming to the General Assembly and seeing that committee is where that moment was like, maybe I should run. Thank you.
So my story is a little bit different. That's the beauty of all the women in the House. If we were all up here, we all come from different backgrounds and different stories, and it's what makes, I think, all of us so great together. But I had been volunteering in my community through my church in a lower income apartment community, mainly with single female moms who were working multiple jobs, weren't able to be home. And so bad guys knew that and showed up and tried to get older boys to join them. So we were part of a volunteer group that was committed to being present in the neighborhood and just doing activities. Well, I would notice that things weren't syncing up with the school district, right? We were volunteering, and the transition from school to after school wasn't great, and didn't really get a great response from the school board member who had been there for a really long time. And so just kept pushing at it. And then finally, about 2 years after doing that, it was a woman who was representing our community on the Board of Supervisors. And she showed up to my office one day and said, "I want you to run for school board." And I was like, "You're crazy," because I had a 12-month-old, a 2-year-old, and a 4-year-old. And I was like, "That's crazy." And she was like, "You are outside of the system. You want what's best for the kids who live here. And I bet if you asked all the moms who volunteer with you, they would say you should do it." So I said, "Okay." So I asked all the moms I volunteer with, "Of course you should do it." So that was, another woman who saw what I was doing in the community and saw an opportunity to run, and she believed in me. And so that's what got me into public service at the school board level. And I absolutely loved local service. It's where my heart is and my passion is in public education. But again, a moment came, and this time I felt more confident, right? Because I knew the systems that were broken in helping kids. So when I saw an opportunity to run at the state level, I thought, all right, I've done a lot of work at the local level, and I'm frustrated by the things that aren't working at the state level. So I stepped up on my own that time to decide, all right, I'm going to run for the House. So that was my journey, and I've really tried hard to help other women see that the advocacy work that we're doing, just like you said, we're doing the advocacy work, we're doing the work, but we oftentimes don't see that lining up with running for the office and the seat at all levels. So that was my journey.
So I've been sitting here saying, okay, Vivian, you've got to break your rule. And that is that I have tried very hard not to say how old I am, because every once in a while there's a little bit of assumptions that go with chronological age. But the only way to give a relevant answer to this question is to say, hey, I graduated college in 1962. I was already married, because that's what you did, white dress and all. And so when I came out of college and we came to the Virginia, Washington, D.C. area, there weren't opportunities for women in 1962. But I had a robust education, and I'm a nerd, and I love getting involved in things. So for me, 15 years of a lot of civic work in a fast-growing county, and EPA and all this and schools, and always being the budget person, but also always being the nerd, always being the one who would read the appendix. Who would write the 15-page single-space with footnotes report on real estate taxes or whatever it may be. But never thinking that I would run for office, because women just, well, we had women locally who ran for office because federal employees were what's called Hatch Act. You couldn't be partisan and be a federal employee, so that opened the door for women to run for office, because most of the workforce was a male workforce in the federal government at the time, but still wasn't for me. Besides that, I'm an introvert. And I'm come from the Midwest, and basically I would describe my family, there were the doers and the done-tos, and they felt they were the done-tos. So nothing said that I should run for office, except, just like Carrie just said, that absolute love of public policy and 15 years of a lot of involvement and always wanting to roll that experience into the next where I might do good. And so things that is, though, part of what happens. I think the world is divided into those who always wanted to run for office and those who are the right person at the right time. And mostly in my day, it was always the male. Well, that's just my destiny, is to run for office. But the right person at the right time for me was no one had filed, and at that time the county was bigger than a congressional district. No one had filed in the race for the chairman of the Board of Supervisors. So here you're sitting with absolutely no political experience, couldn't find anyone, won't go into the details of how in mid-June suddenly I'm the sacrificial lamb running countywide. And the reason I mention that detail is also in those days, women running for office, you will have had to pay your dues, stuffing a heck of a lot of envelopes. There was no professional way to bring your credentials forward. There was definitely two rules about men's credentials and women's credentials. But because I ran that countywide race and had a good enough result, I was able to pay my dues in one big installment. Therefore, 2 years later, having survived it emotionally, the introvert found that people are really quite nice, and you could, and I had an excuse to talk to them, and I really wasn't bothering them, and this is good. I like this. Allowed me then to really refocus on the state level, which has always been my first love since I came to Virginia during massive resistance. And so I'd always wanted to know, coming from Michigan, what had I moved into? So it was that, and then the final item that I will mention, the fact that I always say, even though you say I'm the 22nd, there were 21 women before me, because when I was elected, 4 women were elected, and I had the blessings of it being the last year under the original congressional legislation for the ERA to be passed. So we had a lot of focus on our races, and I had a lot of help, and I also had a wonderful mentor who I'll mention later with Dorothy McDermott, who was one of those pioneering women who came in when there had been so few. So all of it is partly circumstance and partly just loving what you're doing and finding an opportunity that says, if not me, then who?
Those are all good stories. I should note also, I'm not just like this ivory tower person. So I actually ran for Congress in 2006 in the Democratic primary in Rhode Island's 2nd Congressional District. I lost, which is why I'm here. But people say, don't you think you dodged a bullet? Look at what it's like. No, I would prefer to be there. But anyway, but the reason I'm mentioning this is because everybody spoke a little bit about their qualifications or what would make them think that it was time to throw their hat into the ring. And in the research that I've conducted, we found pretty systematically that women are more likely than men to underestimate their qualifications, or it might be men are more likely than women to overestimate their qualifications. And so on paper, these thousands of potential candidates look exactly the same. You wouldn't be able to tell them apart in terms of political experience, political interest, professions, or even their income, education, or other types of backgrounds. Yet when we asked women if they considered themselves qualified to run for office, only about a quarter did, whereas about 2/3 of men did. But it gets worse because women who self-assess as unqualified to run for office don't really think about running for office. Men who check off the box that says, no, I'm not at all qualified to run for office, still have like a 50% chance of giving it serious thought. And so the question then becomes, when you're thinking about recruiting other candidates to join you, when you're thinking about talking to people who say, hey, I'm interested, this is something that I might want to do, how do you define what qualifies a candidate? Because I think one of the challenges that we have is trying to debunk this disconnect between how men and women self-assess what you need to do to succeed in the political arena, and also then beyond the campaign to be a legislator. I know that when I ran, there was a big disconnect between what I thought I needed to know and what I actually needed to know. It was a lot easier to know what I actually needed to know than what I thought I needed to know. So let's go this way this time.
I made several references to being the introvert, et cetera, and then also, I'm also going to throw in women tend to be peer-oriented rather than hierarchical, as well as the fact that there's all kinds of research. We do multitask. Our brain is just wired that way, and I won't go back into anthropology as to why. So those 3 things, in my case, the introvert, but combined with multitasking and combined with the fact that you're peer, I think what Dorothy McDermott saw in me that I didn't recognize as a strength were those qualities. Because what I have seen when most women run for office, they are so much better in really listening and really trying to understand. They have come from their community. They know the complexity of their community, and maybe that's why they feel they don't know enough, because they really have been really involved, again, multitasking rather than, oh, I'm here to save the world. And those kind of qualities I look for in male or female candidates who come to me who are thinking about running for office, really trying to encourage them to, yes, running for office is a business. There's no question about it. You got a critical path plan and make sure that you're ready to do what you're supposed to do when it's supposed to be done. But beyond that, you, the person, have to be somebody that people feel some degree of trust in. And speaking for myself, and I think most successful candidates, you will not enjoy the experience if you don't, in fact, live it, if you aren't there in the moment. And with that, then I think there's a much greater chance that you'll be a successful candidate, and most importantly, be a successful office holder because of those qualities.
Yeah, I always talk to women about, the things that make you successful at being whatever it is, right? Your career, mom, you fill in the blank. Those are the things that make you successful at running for office. It's really not a different skill set. And what makes you a strong candidate is having been involved in your community. Like, the very first job I ever had at 15 was at the Chester YMCA that's in my district. I grew up in my district, and I still had that same job until December of last year, when I finally realized I was too busy and working out at 5 a.m. with 30 other people, I had to give up. But when you're involved in your community and you show up to the YMCA every day, right, and work out, you're building a network of people who know you without makeup on and a hot mess at 5 in the morning, and they have a relationship with you. When I coach soccer, I am not an amazing soccer coach, but my 14-year-old son and his buddies have tolerated me for 6 years. But that whole group of parents, right, they're a group that know that I may not be the best coach, but their kids are having a good time and they're flourishing. And so I always tell folks, it's not about being in politics. It's about having relationships with people in the community you want to represent, so that when it comes time to having a platform and making hard decisions, you've had a diverse perspective of people from different walks of life. And that's what makes you a great candidate. And you can start to get bogged down by, the campaign consultant world has been filled with men for a really long time. And I'm like, don't let them distract you from what the message is for your demographic. You're a woman, and most of them are trying to get our demographic to vote for you. Don't let that pull you away from the depth of what you know about real people who live where you live. And so that's what I try to share. Being political is not what's going to make someone vote for you.
They did, and I will point to 2017 and our recruitment efforts when we had, and that's exactly what we recruited, is women who are involved in their communities, that built the trust that Vivian talked about, that the voters trusted, and they became those naturally good candidates because there was already a base built in, and that people knew that they were in it for the right reasons. Now, it's just human nature. Some people, we're all different, run for other reasons. Our group of candidates were goal-oriented, knew exactly what it is that they wanted to do when they came to Richmond, had been working on certain issues, and they were able to elevate that message and connect with the voters very easily because of the trust that had been built over years. And so, like Vivian noted, that's a good formula for men and women. It's just the reality is that trust factor, and especially now with politics. The voters are thirsting for people who they can trust, and those are there that they are able to trust keep returning to the legislature because there is that trust there. There is that communication that has to continue to go on, because if those women did not, they would not be reelected, and men as well. So I think it's the trust and making sure that those candidates, again, have had a past of working within the community. So I think that's what makes a successful candidate.
Okay, I'm going to ask one final question and then we'll open it up to the audience, although it's a big question. So there's a lot of research that shows, and a lot of people in this room probably won't believe it, but that when women run for office in either primaries or general elections on both sides of the aisle, they're just as likely as men to win once you take into account incumbency status. They overall raise just as much money, and their media coverage looks generally the same as well. Now, that's not to say there aren't episodes of bias and sexism. We can all come up with regular examples of that. But when you look at the aggregate level playing field, it's a lot better than people tend to think it is. No one believes this, so that's a challenge for a different day, and getting that message out matters. But what we're seeing now is more of a move toward, at least in terms of reporting, examples of bias and sexism in the political institutions themselves, right? So we've gotten to the point where it's hard to find, when you move away from like presidential politics, it's hard to find constant examples of women being treated poorly on the campaign trail. So now, because the media generally like to report on what's negative and terrible and awful, they've moved into the state legislatures across the country, they've moved into Congress, and they're highlighting all episodes of bias and sexism there. So my question is, first, how prevalent is it? I know that you all have stories, but when you think broadly across your career, sort of how prevalent is sexism? And second, can you put a sort of more positive spin on it? Is there something you've been able to do, or a conversation you've been able to have, or a success that you've been able to acquire because you come from you come at it from a different perspective, or because of your background as a woman? So let's start in middle and loop around.
Okay. Well, I would say, so I'll start from my career perspective. So I'm an attorney, and I do land use real estate transactional work. And I'm in my 21st year of that. And when I started, I was very, very young, and I was the only woman ever in anything. So all I knew I graduated early. So if you're doing math and how old I am, I finished undergrad in 3 years, and I was 17 when I started college. So I was always the youngest in everything. So I was the youngest by a lot. I was the only woman, and it was a really hard field to be in law, and arguing in front of city councils and boards of supervisors, which were mainly men too. So not only were all my colleagues all men, but everyone I was arguing in front of and trying to win, cases for clients that were all mainly men. And it really made me work really, really hard. Like, I always had this feeling I had to be better than anyone else. And when it wouldn't go well, I'd go and I would watch videos of the best men arguing their cases and figure out, well, what were they doing that I wasn't doing? So I did a lot of self-reflection back then. And so when I got to the House of Delegates, I didn't really have that experience when I was elected to the school board. There were other women that had already been there. Schools are a very female-friendly environment, so serving in public office, it's a really, I didn't experience it like that. I got to the House, and my very first experience when I showed up, and I walk in the building for the first day, and someone said, "Whose secretary are you?" And, or they said, "Who do you work for?" That's what they asked. And I was like, "Oh, I'm a delegate." And they were like, "Oh," they didn't know who I was. And then ran into, I had been there for 2 years, and I thought, well, by now, people will know who I am. And I just left a committee meeting in the Senate having a bill heard, and the senator was like, "Man, that was one of the most interesting bills I had heard." And I was like, "Great." And then I leave, and I get on the elevator with him like a few hours later, and he asked who I was. And I was like, I'm never going to be seen. So it's a different environment because of all the moving pieces in the House. And it was really hard as a new woman to sort of figure out your place, because there weren't a lot of women in the Republican house, right? So you sort of form relationships around people with similar things, right? So you have, you know, your family within your caucus, you have your family within issues, right? There are people who are all education issue people. You find people who care about, you know, public health. You find your people. There weren't a whole lot of women, even when I came in. So it was kind of a hard thing to get advice and figure out. I will tell you where I found help at the time. I had a really great relationship with Jen McClellan because I had served on the school board. She was in Richmond. We had this thing. So I went to her because I knew her really well, and Roxanne Robinson in the House. They were kind of the two women for me that were my sounding board to help me figure out how to make your voice heard when you were a new female. But it was definitely tough, even now. So I can't imagine what it was like, but it's still really hard now. And a lot of seniority, right, matters in the governing bodies. And you still have a lot of men who have had more seniority than women. So that was a struggle for me coming from a school board where I really felt like women had an equal voice and were reflected as having the same amount of knowledge as our male counterparts, to come into a bigger body and not always feel the same way.
Yeah, that's the way it Definitely. Let me just start with now rather than, and then I'll go back. Now, just I think 2 sessions ago, the U.S. Supreme Court changed its rules of argument after a study showed how women justices were interrupted both by their male colleagues as well as people presenting to the Supreme Court more than men. So they changed the rules. I was just looking at a news clip today. One of the police departments in Texas, the women have gotten together because they can't get bulletproof vests that fit. So there's just so many things that we're not used to seeing. And one of those things that we're not used to seeing is females in an elected office. We see it more and more and more, and it will be changing as we see the anchors, et cetera, and we see women commentators. We hear them talk about the bank crisis, and there's no longer the women talk about this and real people talk about that. So things have changed, but we've still got a long ways to go, which is why I start now. So some of my rules of thumb were, I realized very early on in my first campaign, again with no political experience at all, but reading the room, if you will. Oh, by the way, the reason why sometimes it's been commented that I have very good posture, because I would sit in the car for 5 minutes. I've got to go in there. I can't go in there. And when you finally go in the room, you go in like you belong. And that is part of the reason also that we see some of this image, that you don't look like an elected official. But one of the things rule of thumb that I decided on early on, I had to flash tough at least 20% of the time. So we can communicate, we can do whatever, but somewhere, even if it's just 2 minutes door to door, or if it's a 20-minute speech, about 20% of it has to be either by the way I karate chop or whatever it may be, but it has to be a strength that people think that I can do the job, because they'll always open the door to the woman, but they don't necessarily believe that you are capable, which then became another asset for me in particular, given the fact that I still get reelected. I guess it has to be an asset. And that is that when I knocked on the door, I'm not assuming that you think I can do the job. So especially with 15 years of civic experience, whatever you ask me about, we're going to talk about. Landing policy at Dulles, by God, yes I did, we're going to talk about. So the issue then became, and I still do it today because it again, is very important as a legislator to really hear what somebody's saying, not just come with my pre-canned bumper sticker type of motto. And it has served me very well as far as getting very good information from talking directly with citizens who may not feel that they want to write you about something, but their life is every bit as genuine. So that becomes another issue. Back then, one of the other things while I was elected, because of the push to finally, Virginia could be the last state to pass ERA, we didn't. And as the years went on, and there I am as one of so few women, I determined that however much I cared about it or informed consent on mastectomies or a number of other things that women were not considered on, still I wasn't going to let those issues detract me. That I wasn't going to take insult. I was just going to let it roll. Yes, there were things that were written to Mr. Watts as opposed to Mrs. And that just went, and you just don't take exception on it because you're going to stay with your eyes on what you're there to do. And in doing it, you hope, and it didn't always happen, but because certainly that phenomenon is still alive and well. The woman says something, 5 minutes later, the man says it, and the committee says, yes, this is what we ought to do. And so it is a continued challenge, and not to recognize that you, again, handicap yourself, or to become overly sensitive to it. You handicap yourself, and I'll be darned if I'm going to let that happen to me.
All right, so first I want to address something that you mentioned, which was the fundraising. And one thing, and this is again from my personal experience, is that I've noticed I've had to not challenge, but push a little harder to make my numbers better. Because when I did my research, there is, and to me, there is inequity in the initial giving. And so I think women, and especially minority women, have to push a little harder, especially from communities that we come from. There are not necessarily donors who are who have money. I'm just going to be blunt. So I just want everyone to know there's more work that goes into it. Compared to the 5 hours that a white male will spend trying to raise money, I probably had to spend 10 to 15, and a lot of it is pushing or calling more. So that's the first thing. Second, I will tell you all about an experience I had. This is it was the ultrasound bill here in Virginia a while ago, and I was quoted by the New York Times, and I said, I am going to say this on the floor. And a male member after caucus grabbed me by the arms, literally, and it was a very unpleasant experience, and told me, don't say that on the House floor. And that, it was shocking, and it was demeaning, especially because it was already published out there. And so I say that just to say we've got a long ways to go, because we have to have free exchange of ideas. We have to be honest when we're talking and when we're debating. And to silence me so that can happen it's not partisan, we've got to be able to express ourselves, and especially when it comes to issues concerning our own bodies. So the other thing I want to mention, though, with that bias is that I'm intentional, and I think that other women I notice are intentional, that we support each other, especially when there is an idea that is already put out there. It's sort of, that was Carrie's idea. Yeah, she said that. And also bracketing our successes, elevating our colleagues' successes, especially women. We have to, I think, do that, because then it's noticed a little bit more. Because I do believe, and from my observations, that it's often shoved under. And I will give you, another scenario where I was my first reelection, and I had a woman opponent running as a Republican. She was brilliant. She was a new American. She was a college professor. She was absolutely delightful. And I was interviewed by the reporter, and she was. Then the article said, Sasha Gong and Charniele Herring have a lot in common, especially when it comes to cooking. And it was about, yes, I am not 2009, it was about our favorite dishes. Now, we talked about taxes, we talked about transportation, we talked about healthcare, we talked about education. But after that debate, and when we were interviewed by the reporter in the hall, that's what we got. So I that's another thing, sort of, we both called each other because we're like, can you believe this? So again, but elevating, and so that's why I like to mention her name, Sasha Gong. She was absolutely wonderful, and we need to just continue to elevate each other, and I think that will help overcome bias. Thank you.
And I should note, it's not only so when I said that women and men raise the same amount of money, if women have to work harder, that's obviously not fair. The other thing I should note is women and men win elections at equal rates, but if women are objectively more qualified than the men against whom they're competing, then they should actually be winning at greater rates. So, I don't want anything that I said to be perceived as there's complete equity out there. It's just that when you think about, oh, can a woman win? Yeah. She can win just as often as a man. That doesn't mean that her experience getting to the finish line is going to be the same. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I'm happy to take questions from the audience. Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. I just wanted to ask, and anyone can answer the question, is do you think it's necessary to have to go up through the electoral steps? Like, for instance, you should be part of the school board and then maybe run for county supervisors, or and then maybe go for the delegation? Or do you think it's okay for someone to just go, I think I'm going to go for the state level?
I can start. So I think it's more important that you've been involved in your community than where you start. It's very obvious if people are running for office to run for office versus your community, that people deserve to have their voices heard, and you want to be that person who represents their voice in whatever it is. And I think that's way more important. Do I think it's helpful? I do think it's helpful. Like, my time on the school board really shaped me and helped me because you're more connected to people when you're in local office, and you get more, I miss that, right? You just can't be the one who answers every single thing all the time because you have so many more people. So I think you learn a lot more about individuals and how to manage things before you go into higher office, but I don't think it's a necessary path.
And I would give the same advice to women or men, absolutely not. That what you need to do is get really involved in something that you really care about. And that may not be government policy, it may be the environment, whatever it may be that you're really, really involved, and then you might be the right person at the right time to run for office, but that's not the most important thing that you can do. And also, I've got to say, as someone who's still in the House of Delegates, as Carrie and I were laughing, it's not just because I've always shared my district with Dick Sasslaw. Other than that, that we need good people at all levels. And this up and out is just unfortunate. I am really sad that we will lose some of our House members, not just because of redistricting, but some of them making a decision to run for higher office rather than staying in the House and really making us that kind of power that needs to be a co-equal branch.
And I would just like to say that, yeah, connection with the community is what's most important, but people should run for what they have a passion for. I was told, don't do House of Delegates, start with school board, start with a city council, and my passion wasn't there. I was already doing work at the state level. And so if I'm running for something I really have no interest in, that's what I think is a formula for someone who did not be successful either in their campaign or when they serve, because there's just not an interest. And God love the people that are in local government because they deal with a lot. I just don't think I had the temperament for it, honestly, and my interest was at the state level.
Another question. Yes.
Have you ever experienced imposter syndrome? And if so, how did you overcome that?
I'll start. So, and it's sort of like this. I know what you mean, but that's my whole life. So I never thought I'm an imposter. because I was the only black girl in my class and in first grade. So I've always been the only one. So it's just maybe the way I grew up that I don't feel out of place where I am, or when I became the first leader and woman leader and an African American leader. I didn't feel like an imposter because it's just the natural way that I grew up, that I was always tended to be the first or the only one. So for me, I haven't experienced it in that sense.
And having just recently read the article, I don't know whether it was in the Atlantic or New Yorker or where it was, on the imposter syndrome. It's interesting as you read the first half of it, it's all about the imposter syndrome, that I'm really not good enough and someone's going to discover it and I'm going to say something and then jigs up, I don't belong here. The other half of that article is all about that you aren't getting credit for what you in fact are. And I related a lot more to the back half of the article than I did to the front half of the article. That I think it's far more common in women's experience and definitely in minority experiences that you aren't given credit for what you are, what you bring to the table. On a very light note, I'm going to finish by saying I made it a point. Again, when I came in, fortunately, there were enough of women that they'd run out of women's committees, so I got appointed to Finance Committee on taxes, which is what I'd always done on the budget, and that was just couldn't be better. So there I am with 19 men. And I made it a point not to ever mention where I got my background in assessment and gross receipts tax and you name it. And I can be boring on that, I know. But about midway through that first session, we had been talking about gross receipts tax. And as we filed out of the committee room, at least 3, 4, 5 men asked me, "Where'd you get your background?" Now, if I'd said to them, League of Women Voters and 15-page single space with footnotes, it wouldn't have meant a thing to them. In that case, I didn't have the credentials that women now come into office with, as we have 2 lawyers here. But I didn't have those kind of credentials. But I still think even without that example from the past, there are a number of times when it's not the imposter syndrome, it's the other flip side of the coin that you're not being recognized for what you do bring.
I think for me, it's oftentimes I care so much about good policy, and the system doesn't always produce the outcome of good policy. And so someone who wakes up every day and you're like, I just want kids to read in Virginia. Like, my feet hit the floor every day, and that's what I'm focused on. And for the system that you're working within to not always do what you think is right by people is a defeating feeling some days, right? You're like, this is not what people expect of government. And it doesn't always work out for what you think is right for good policy. And so that's a really hard system. Sometimes you feel like, what am I doing here? Because this is not the way it should work. And then I think other things, you don't always get placed where you feel like your gifts are, right? Like, I got put on courts committee and I didn't really want to be on courts committee, but I was there. And I got placed on, now I'm on education, right? Which is like my passion. So I feel like my gifts can be shown there. But I also got put on appropriations, and there's a reason I'm a lawyer, and I have someone else who's manages my finances. So I spent, I was a little like deer in the headlights when I found out that's where I was going, but I worked really hard to learn it. And so you can feel a little bit like there are all these other people who know more than you about something, but if you're willing to work at it, you start to feel more confident in that space. And so there's 2 different areas that I experienced it a little bit, where I just felt like I didn't know as much as people. You're like, man, how do I do this work and do a good job? So in those different ways, a little bit of that feeling.
Shouldn't do this, but I'm going to add to what Carrie said. Quite frankly, that's one of the most important things, partly because we're short sessions and we're not year-round, et cetera, is to always assume you don't know, because we're covering the total waterfront of issues. And if you don't go into it assuming that you've got to learn something, either technically or because times change, speaking for myself, if you're going to do the job, you've got to stay up to date, relevant, and really enjoy, not feel threatened by the opportunity to put more pieces together from your life experience, your area of the state, your involvement in a whole wide variety of issues that is always different in each of the members.
We have time for one last question.
Okay, so I have a question. Have you ever gotten a bill that ties? What do you do after a bill ties?
So if there's a tie vote,
Yeah.
Bill?
Do you just vote again?
It dies. When we have bills that are before us and a tie vote, the bill doesn't move forward. So we have a lot of, the way our committees work is, especially that's where bills start. They start in subcommittees and they work their way. They survive a subcommittee to the committee. And if they survive their committee, sometimes they get sent to another committee. And then they eventually end up on the House floor. But along that journey, a tie vote defeats the bill. So if it gets tied, it dies.
But I have to do the but. There is a trick.
If you have a
No,
really
you-
good friend.
So you got to sort of know going in you don't have the votes, right? So you have someone vote no, basically. So they can vote on the prevailing side to reconsider the bill. Then you move the bill by for a day. And then you go to work to find people to change their votes. And it happens more than you think. And then you can come back, try it again, and boom, the bill passes. But it takes a lot of work, and you got to be ready. So you got to know your vote count coming in, and you would do that on a bill that's sort of controversial, or you're hearing rumors that people don't like it, and then you just work with somebody to vote the way to help kill it. But then you can bring it back so you have time. So there's always a trick to it.
Take away from what Charniele said is that you've got to know procedure. You learn the procedure as you go along, but you also have to have trust among your colleagues so that you have a network that you could call upon for that. And then the third thing, which is for me, so fine, next year I'll be back again. I've just learned from this. And there's a lot of bills that have a second and a third round before you finally get it right, because again, short sessions, we don't have the time to really work some of these things out that we need to, but there's a lot of things that in that first nays, oh, okay, fine, now I know who to talk to.
Yeah, it also is interesting because you'll come up with what you think is a great idea. I had an aha moment this week, and so I was like, I think so-and-so brought that bill, and they'll name the year, and it was left in committee. And you're like, oh, okay, so what happened to it back then? So there's usually stories associated with where bills end up and why they end up there, and good ideas that just, sometimes don't make it back. But then there are bills that struggle for years and keep dying, and eventually people figure out compromises to bring it back to life and get it passed. So
Chime in when Charniele said I just couldn't do the local office bit. It wasn't for me. I've always described being in local office like a weekly poker game. And it's just, whereas being in the legislature, it's very much like a long-term chess game. And you're always strategizing some of the things that we've said, and you've got to be at it for the long term. But that's the type of issues that we deal with as well. And yet I love it compared to Congress because we're close enough to see what works, not so much just automatic theory of one party or another.
Great question, by the way. It was really good. We got a future delegate.
So thank you. And before we get to the formal conclusion, let me just say that I hope everybody in the audience today, women perhaps especially, have at least considered running for office. And you don't have to make the decision today. You don't have to make the decision tomorrow. But if it at least appears on your radar screen now after hearing this conversation, then I think this was a conversation definitely worth having. So thank you.
Wonderful panel for being here tonight, but equally importantly, for all that they do for the Commonwealth and for all of us. I want to thank you, the audience, for coming as well. And not only is this the 100th anniversary of women serving in the General Assembly, but it's also the 200th anniversary of the Library of Virginia. So on the table outside, you'll find some literature and our magazine that tells you about other activities and programs we're doing this year, and I hope that you'll be back for more. And I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Thank you for being here.